Hello, everyone. We'll get started in a minute. Hello, thank you for joining me this afternoon on this somber day, actually, since we are commemorating Tisha B'Av. We've actually talked about Tisha B'Av before in one of the previous sessions. I don't remember exactly which one, but we studied the famous story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, which is the story used by the rabbis to explain why the Second Temple was destroyed. And since Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, is a day in which we commemorate many losses within Jewish history and throughout Jewish history, including the destruction of the First and the Second Temple. We spent some time studying that. So if you'd want to do a little bit of Tisha B'Av specific studying this afternoon on your own, feel free to go to our website, wbtla.org, navigate your way to the study resources from our online platform, the WBT at Home, and you can look for that section or that session that talks Kamsa versus Bar Kamsa. That's the title, and you can study that passage. Today we are going to continue on in the same area of the Talmud that we looked at last week. Last week we talked about God and does God pray, and now the rabbis ask the question, does God get angry? Right after the question that they ask about, does God pray, they go into anger. So that's what we're going to focus on today. And I thought it would be also appropriate given Tisha B'Av and the anger that I sense seems to be existing all over the place. And sometimes even welling up within me, as we've talked about before when we listen to the news or see certain things around us. So I thought we could study that and think about what are the lessons that our tradition is trying to teach us about our relationship with anger, because I don't think this text is really supposed to be a text in which we're supposed to imagine literally if God gets angry, but we're really supposed to take the lessons to our own lives. And so as we read through this today, I want you to focus on what is it that the rabbis are teaching us about how we are supposed to understand our own anger and the anger of others. Okay, so of course, Zoom protocol, as we always do, you have the opportunity after I go through it and offer some insights or reflections that you will have the opportunity to share your insights and reflections and questions. And so you can virtually raise your hand or put something in the chat or the Q&A, and I'll try and get to as many of those as I can today. So let's begin with the study, the blessing for engaging in the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Thank you, God, for giving us this opportunity to engage in the study of Torah. Amen. And by the way, we are breaking Tisha B'Av rules at the moment. Technically, on Tisha B'Av, you're not supposed to study Talmud or Torah. You're only supposed to read Eicha, the Book of Lamentations, and sit in the pain of this day. It's the only other 24-hour fast day besides Yom Kippur. And the reason we're not supposed to study Talmud or Torah or do any study of that matter is because study is supposed to bring us joy, and this is not a day of joy. So we technically, I guess, we shouldn't be doing this, but as liberal Jews, I find that in the hierarchy of needs, our need is much greater to learn about ourselves, about the world in which we live, and about our tradition. And because this theme I feel is appropriate for Tisha B'Av, I felt comfortable that we could move ahead and study Talmud together today. Okay, so thank you again, and we are going to get started with the text. I will share the text with you, and then I'll read through it as I always do, read through it once, and then we'll go back. This one's a little longer, and also I want to point out most of the Talmud that we have been studying together and we'll continue to study together is really more stories. That's why I called it Talmud Tales. But this last week and even this week get a little bit more kind of the borderline between Agadah and Halacha. The Agadah meaning stories, Halacha meaning law. And so this doesn't necessarily read completely like a story, but it does give you a taste, similar to last week, of other elements of Talmud study where you're not necessarily picking apart a story per se, but you're starting to look at how law is formed or how the Jewish mindset is formed through conversations back and forth. So just so you know what you're getting yourself into today. All right, let's look at the story together. Again, it's from Brachot 7a, continuation from last week. And said Rabbi Yochanan in the name of Rabbi Yossi, how do we know that one should not placate a person when he is angry? It is in line with the following verse of scripture. My face will go, and then I will give you rest. Said the Holy One, blessed be he, to Moses, wait until my angry countenance passes, and then I shall give you rest. But does the Holy One, blessed be he, get angry? Indeed so. For it has been taught on Tanaite authority, a God that is angry every day. And how long is this anger going to last? A moment. And how long is a moment? It is 158,888th part of an hour, which the math is 1/100th of a second. And no creature except for the wicked Balaam has ever been able to fix the moment exactly. For concerning him, it has been written, he knows the knowledge of the Most High. Now, if Balaam did not even know what his beast was thinking, was he likely to know what the Most High is thinking? But this teaches that he knew exactly how to reckon the very moment that the Holy One, blessed be he, would be angry. That is in line with what the prophet said to Israel. O my people, remember now what Balak, king of Moab, devised, and what Balaam, son of Beor, answered him, that you may know the righteous acts of the Lord. Said Rabbi Elazar, the Holy One, blessed be he, said to Israel, know that I did any number of acts of righteousness with you, for I did not get angry in the time of the wicked Balaam. For had I gotten angry, not one of the enemies of Israel would have survived, not a remnant. That is in line with what Balaam said to Balak. How shall I curse whom God has not cursed, and how shall I loathe whom the Lord has not loathed? This teaches that for the entire time, God did not get mad. And how long is God's anger? It is a moment. And how long is a moment? Said Rabbi Abin, and some say Rabbi Abina, a moment lasts as long as it takes to say a moment. And how do we know that a moment is how long God is angry? For it is said, for his anger is but for a moment, his favor is for a lifetime. If you like, you may derive the lesson from the following. Hide yourself for a little while until the anger be past. And when is God angry? Said Abaye, it is during the first 3 hours of the day when the comb of the rooster is white and it stands on one foot. But it stands on one foot every hour. To be sure, it stands on its foot every hour. But in all the others, it has red streaks. And in the moment at hand, there are no red streaks in the comb of the rooster. A certain Sadducean who lived in Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi's neighborhood would give him plenty of trouble by citing verses of scripture. One day, Joshua took a rooster and put it between the legs of his bed and watched it. He thought, when that very moment comes that the comb is unstreaked, I shall curse him. When that very moment came, Joshua was dozing. He said to him, that fact implies that it is not proper to do things this way. And his tender mercies are over all his works. And it is written, neither is it good for the righteous to punish. Just reading through that, I can imagine a few of you are thinking, what is this? This is a lot. There's a lot in those 3 pages that we have to try and break down. And of course, I will go over this idea of this character Balaam and give a little context for that. Yes, this is complicated. It's not easy. I struggle with it too, but that's the beauty of it. And again, what I want you to be focusing on is what is the lesson that is trying to be taught here about how we are supposed to understand our connection to anger, our own anger or the anger of others. Really, God is being used here. Both, of course, there's probably a little bit of it that is theological, but really, I think the rabbis are not trying to really understand when exactly is God angry. I think it's supposed to be a tool to open up other conversations and other thoughts on our own. So that's what I'm hoping this is doing for you once you have a sense of what's actually being said here. So let's break it down as best we can, and then we'll open it up for talking about this. And I also do have a PS, a postscript from Maimonides that I want to share before we open it up to conversations and feedback. Okay, so we're going to go back one more time. We'll go through it and try and break this down a little. I know it since it doesn't read like a story, it can be a little tough. So let's see what we can get out of this. Okay. I really see this as a few parts. The first part of this teaching is really in just the first paragraph. So said Rabbi Yochanan in the name of Rabbi Yossi, how do we know that one should not placate a person when he is angry? In other words, when you come across someone who is angry, how are we supposed to know? Where is it taught that we shouldn't try and calm them down in the midst of their being angry? Already there's assumption here that is suggesting if someone is really angry, don't try to placate them in the midst of that anger. Okay, so that's an assumption that we are already coming into with this text. And it is in line with the following verse of scripture. So what's the proof for the fact that you're not supposed to intervene and placate someone in the midst of their anger? My face will go and then I will give you rest. Said the Holy One, blessed be he, to Moses, wait until my angry countenance passes and then I shall give you rest. In other words, when Moses meets God, and God does not allow Moses to see God's face, only to see God's back. This is proof that wait until my angry countenance passes and I shall give you rest. In other words, wait until my anger passes and then there will be relief and peace, right? So the proof text here is, okay, the reason you shouldn't try and placate someone in the midst of their anger is that just as God was angry and God's angry countenance passed by, Moses wasn't able to then have any sense of peace or really connect with God until that had passed. In other words, let the anger pass before you engage with someone who has just been in the midst of a moment of anger or rage. Okay, so you can agree or disagree, but the tradition seems to be suggesting here that the time to argue with someone, the time to engage with someone is not in the midst of their anger. Anyone who has been in a fight with someone that they love at any point knows that sometimes if you're trying to placate someone in the midst of their raging argument or debate with you, sometimes, if not most of the time, that can backfire significantly on you and lead to more destruction and disaster. So here, this seems to be suggesting that no, wait, okay? So that's part one. Then we move on to a whole new set based on this passage, which talks about God's angry countenance, God's angry face. But does the Holy One, blessed be he, get angry? The rabbis are asking, does God get angry? Yes, God does get angry. And now this seems to be going beyond the fact that if we were to read the Torah, of course, there are examples of God being angry. So here, the rabbis are not asking this simple question, does God literally get angry according to scripture? Because there's plenty of proof of that. This is a deeper question. And I think that's why we have to be seeing this as really not a conversation about whether or not God expresses God's anger, but it's really about something deeper within ourselves and our own relationship, both with God and with the world around us. So does God get angry? Yes. For it's taught a God that is angry every day. So the proof is Psalms, in Psalm 7, verse 12, it shows God gets angry every day. And how long is that anger going to last? If God does get angry every day, and we can imagine there are a million things that God could get angry about on a daily basis. Just imagine the things that may anger you on a regular basis, any level of anger that may exist, right? We can imagine that God, if God were to be a human form that thought like we do, we could imagine that if God were to look down on this world, that there would be plenty to be angry about. So how long does this anger last? A moment. Okay, already. It seems to be suggesting that the rabbis are saying God's anger is not something that lasts for a long period of time. Even if God were to look down, so to speak, on the world and see all the challenges and problems of the world, even then, God is only angry for a minute. Now, remember, whenever we're talking about God, similar to how we were talking about God and God's prayers, we're supposed to imagine, okay, if God acts this way, how much the more so are we supposed to act? It's supposed to be a guideline that if the ultimate being, the ultimate image of perfection is to be angry, but that image of perfection and the Holy One, blessed be he, is only angry for a moment. Now already we're supposed to be imagining, wow, if God's only angry for a moment, think about how long I can sit in my anger. And it's not just the anger that can come with one argument with another person when you're debating, or where you're truly angry at someone for something they did wrong in the moment. We know that anger turns to resentment, that there are various levels of anger that we experience throughout our lives and through our relationships. So how long is this moment? The rabbis want to know. No, why not? Let's try and understand. If God is only angry for a moment, how long is that moment? I don't know where they came up with this. I'd have to do some more research, but according to this first interpretation, it's 158,888th part of an hour, okay? Which, according to one thing I found, is 1/100th of a second. In other words, a very, very, very short amount of time, right? So now we're being told that this moment is a very specific and very narrow time that God expresses God's anger. So now you have to be thinking, if God's anger is only expressed in that minute little 1/1000th, I'm sorry, of a second, what are we supposed to be thinking about in terms of our own anger? And no creature except for the wicked Balaam has ever been able to fix the moment exactly. Because the next question would be, okay, well, if God is angry, we could assume that God's anger could be a significantly epic, destructive feeling or emotion that could lead to severe repercussions across the universe. So if we could understand exactly when God is angry, that could make a big difference in terms of how we understand the flow of our day, and how we would brace ourselves for that moment of God's anger if we were to imagine that God was angry every single day at a specific time on the dot every day. But according to the rabbis, you can't figure that out. There was only one person who could figure that out, and it was Balaam. He's the character from the book of Numbers. If you think about the prayer Ma Tovu, if you ever go to a service in the morning, a Shabbat or a weekday morning service, one of the first prayers that we offer at morning services is Ma Tovu. Ma Tovu. There are many different tunes to it. I'm not going to try and sing it for you. How numerous, how beautiful are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel. It is something that comes from the book of Numbers. That's a passage. It's a prayer that we offer when we enter into the sanctuary, the idea of being a part of this beautiful sanctuary and this beautiful community. And it comes from the book of Numbers and comes from a story about this character, Balaam, who was a prophet, a foreign prophet, not Jewish, who was tasked by the king of the Moabites, Balak, who saw that the Israelites were coming, and he was scared about them coming and destroying his people. And so he wanted Balaam, who is a known sorcerer, to curse the Israelite people. And so Balaam actually has a relationship with a very unique and special relationship with God, where God speaks to Balaam and tells Balaam, no, you will do what I say. And instead of cursing the Israelite people, you will bless them. Okay, so that's the basic background. You can go and look, if you want to look at the story in more depth, go to Numbers chapters 22 through 24 or so, and you'll be able to see the whole story. Balaam is the only one, for example, who has a talking animal. His donkey talks as he's on the road to meet Balak. It's a famous story. So definitely worth checking out. Okay, so here, no one except wicked Balaam, even though he was someone who blessed the Israelites instead of cursing them. For concerning him, it is written, he knows the knowledge of the Most High, because there's a specific passage in there in the story of Balaam that he had this special, unique relationship with God, and he knew about God's will. Now, if Balaam did not even know what his beast was thinking, that's reference to his donkey that he was riding on, who was trying to get out of the way of an angel, and Balaam kept beating his donkey because he didn't realize that there was an angel in the way. If Balaam isn't able to really even understand what his beast is thinking, how is he supposed to know the innermost thoughts of God? is a question the rabbis ask, understandably. But they respond, but this teaches that he knew exactly how to reckon the very moment that the Holy One, blessed be he, would be angry. So their argument is, because of that passage in that quote from Numbers 24:16, they are saying that is proof that actually, even though Bilam seemed to be oblivious to understanding his own donkey, he was somehow connected to God, and therefore in a way that he would be able to know exactly when God was angry for that 1/1000th of a second. That is in line with what the prophet said to Israel. Oh, my people, remember now what Balak, king of Moab, that's the guy who hired Bilam to curse the Jews, devised, and what Bilam, son of Beor, answered him, that you may know the righteous acts of the Lord. In other words, that even though Balak asked this Bilam to curse them, instead, he blessed them. And so that's another proof text to show that Bilam had this special relationship with God. Okay, so you're seeing they're trying to understand. If you're thinking about it, we've declared that God does get angry. God, how long is God's anger last? It lasts just a moment. How long is that moment? 1/100th of a second. How are we supposed to know when that actually occurs in the day? Well, there's one person who knows. No one else knows exactly what that time is, but there is one person, and it was Bilam. And in other words, that means no one today could ever figure that out. And they then give proof text to suggest that Bilam had this special relationship with God. Now we go to a different one. Said Rabbi Elazar, the Holy One, blessed be he, said to Israel, know that I did any number of acts of righteousness with you, for I did not get angry in the time of the wicked Bilam, for had I gotten angry, not one of the enemies of Israel would have survived, not a remnant. That is in line with what Bilam said to Balak. How shall I curse whom God has not cursed, and how shall I loathe whom the Lord has not loathed? This teaches that for that entire time, God did not get mad. This is a reference to the fact that when Bilam offers this blessing to all the Israelites, he also offers a curse to all the other nations. I'll just show it to you just for 1 second so you have a sense of what I'm talking about. Sometimes, especially when you are studying Talmud and you are looking at proof texts and you're trying to understand their line of reasoning, it sometimes is very helpful to go and look at the verses or look at what's surrounding that specific verse. So just so you understand the context of what's being referred to here, this is the beginning of what Bilam said to everyone. Word of Bilam, son of Beor, word of the man whose eye is true, words of him who hears God's speech, who obtains knowledge from the Most High and beholds visions of the Almighty. Okay, another link goes on. Okay. Here, now he starts to curse, even though he blesses the Israelites. Here's a curse, basically imagining God speaking these curses through Bilam. And it says, he saw Amalek, and taking up his theme, he said, a leading nation is Amalek, but its fate is to perish forever. He saw the Canaanites, and taking up his theme said, though your abode be secure and your nest be set among cliffs, yet shall Canaan be consumed when Ashur takes you captive. And he took up his theme and said, alas, who can survive except God has willed it? Ships come from the quarter of Kittim. They subject Ashur, subject Eber. They too shall perish forever. In other words, in this speech of blessing the Israelites, God is also declaring God's power to destroy all of these other people. But God doesn't do it right then. So the Talmud is suggesting God could have just destroyed all of those kingdoms right then, right? How shall I... For had I gotten angry, not one of the enemies of Israel would have survived. However, God didn't destroy all of those right then. So this is the proof that God has made a decision, even in that moment of God's anger, not to destroy everything. And now they go back and ask it again. How long is God's anger? It is a moment. This is now a second argument for an interpretation of how long God's anger lasts. And how long is a moment? Rabbi says, it's as long as it takes to say a moment, which is longer than 1/100th of a second, but still a very short amount of time where God expresses God's anger. And how do we know that a moment is how long God is angry? For it is said, for his anger is but for a moment, his favor is for a lifetime. Quoting Psalms to suggest, again, God's anger is brief and his favor is everlasting, that the anger is minimal compared to the love and support of the world. And how do we know that a moment is We just read that. And if you like, you may derive the lesson from the following. Here's another proof text. Hide yourself for a little while until the anger be past. And when is God angry? It is during the first 3 hours of the day when the comb of the rooster is white and it stands on one foot, meaning the rooster stands on one foot, but it stands on one foot every hour. In other words, how are we supposed to know exactly when? Oh, it's when the rooster, in the first 3 hours of the day, when the comb of the rooster is all white, when you don't see any red, and it's standing on one foot. But then the argument back is, well, it stands on one foot all the time. To be sure, it stands on its foot every hour, but in all the others, it has red streaks. All of the other hours of the day, that comb has red streaks in it. And in the moment at hand, there are no red streaks in the comb. So that's the specific moment when God is angry, according to this. Then they bring a story to try and teach us something from this. A certain Sadducean who lived in Rabbi Joshua ben Levi's neighborhood would give him plenty of trouble by citing verses of scripture. An annoying man who would just cite scripture left and right, I guess, to Rabbi Joshua. And one day Joshua took a rooster and put it between the legs of his bed and watched it. And he thought, when that very moment comes that the comb is unstreaked, I shall curse him. He was waiting for that moment where if he could line up his curse with God's anger, then this man would be cursed, and who knows what would happen, but he would somehow be punished, that this annoying man would be punished. If he could line up his anger with God's anger, it would be an exponential explosion of anger in the world directed towards this man. But when that very moment came, Joshua was dozing. He said to him, that fact implies that it is not proper to do things this way. In other words, now the Talmud is teaching us that approach, this idea of trying to find the right time to be angry and to line up your anger in a way that will deliver the biggest punch, the biggest destructive power against someone else, is not the way we're supposed to understand our anger. We are not supposed to strategize with the deliverance of our anger out into the world, right? Imagine you are angry, you want to express that anger, and it's not that you're going to do it right in this moment. You are going to wait for the exact, perfect time to deliver that anger. And our tradition is saying, no, don't waste your time. Don't spend your time trying to approach anger and the deliverance of your anger in that way. And in his tender mercies are over all his works, and it is written, neither is it good for the righteous to punish. Okay. This is a lot. Even reading through it, even though I don't see you, I can feel that this is like, oh my gosh, what's going on here? So let's in a moment, we're going to get to your thoughts on all of this. But what stands out to me is this idea that our anger is not supposed to be an overwhelming force in our lives. We are supposed to minimize it. Even God minimizes God's anger. The idea, the concept is that there is the most powerful force in the world has the capability of being anger and holding resentment for a variety of reasons for as long as God would want. And God doesn't even do that. So how are we supposed to understand our anger? In those moments where we are feeling the rage build up inside us or that frustration, we are not, number one, supposed to let that overwhelm us or overtake our personality or overtake our day or our life. That is destructive. And on top of that, we're also not supposed to strategize how to strike with anger. That is also not the Jewish way. The Jewish way is not to be strategic with how we want to attack other people. So I think those are the things that I'm taking away from this. And there was just a gleaning that I found that I thought was a nice postscript to this that I just want to share with you. And then I want to open it up to any questions, thoughts, frustrations, whatever it may be. But I just want to read this one passage from Maimonides, the famous Maimonides, famous rabbi. And this is what he wrote. So too with anger, which is an extremely destructive trait. And it is fitting that one should distance oneself from it to the most extreme and train himself not to get angry, even at something at which it is appropriate to be angry. If he wishes to make a point with his family or his community, if he was a trustee and he wishes to improve their ways, he should feign anger in front of them in order to impress them, but he should be in control of himself when he is feigning anger, for he should not truly be angry. The sages stated, anyone who becomes angry is like one who practices idolatry, one of the worst things you can do in our tradition. And they stated, anyone who is angry, if he is wise, his wisdom flees from him. If he is a prophet, his prophecy flees from him. Those who live with rage, their lives aren't worth living. Therefore, they commanded us to distance ourselves from anger to the point where we will not be sensitive to that which is worth being angry about. This is the best way and the way of the righteous. They will take insults, but they will not insult others. They will heed their shame, and they will not respond. They only act out of love, and they are happy even in their affliction. It is written of them, and those who love him are like the sun that comes out when it is most mighty. Okay. Some of those things are we could spend more time even thinking about that. What does it mean to feign anger? You're not actually supposed to ever, according to Maimonides, actually feel deep anger inside you. You may have to feign it in order to teach a lesson, in order to really be a part of something bigger, but you're not supposed to internalize that anger. And when you do internalize anger, when you express anger, what it does is it takes away your power in this world, that it is more detrimental to you than it is fruitful and productive. So that's just another little interesting twist that we get from Maimonides. At this point, I would love to open it up, see if anyone has any comments or questions. And I know it's a tough one, but again, I think today being Tisha B'Av, where this is about not only sadness and mourning, but it's also about, at least for me, the anger that comes from the fact that we have an entire history of people trying to destroy us. And that even in the world today, there's much to be angry about and frustrated about. This, to me, what I take from this and internalize is that there is a place for anger, and it's okay to have that anger, but it needs to be minimal in our day-to-day existence. That we also then need to think about strategies that remove elements of anger, right? That's what they talk about when you have unhealthy relationships with people. Sometimes the best thing you have to do is end that relationship in order to go back to a place of productivity and health. So if we are constantly being reminded of anger, how do we deal with that? And how do we do that in a way that doesn't neglect the world around us? Because I could understand an argument being, well, how are you suggesting I just shut myself out from the world? Because every time I look out at the world, I'm angry at what I see. And yes, it's not, I don't think it's about shutting ourselves out from the world, but it is trying to figure out what's the kind of response that we can have when we see those things that frustrate and anger us. Can we shift that emotion to something else? What's a more productive way? Or how do we take that anger in a moment and transition it into something else? And I don't have the easy answer for that, but I think that's the challenge that's being presented to us here, is that sitting in that anger is the type of destruction that led to the destruction of the first and second temples. What I talked about last night in the story of Kamsa Bar Kamsa, if you want to go check it out, is this concept of baseless hatred is what leads to the destruction of the temple, and therefore leads to the destruction of the unification of the Jewish people. And so in today's world, if we allow hatred, which is an outcropping of anger, continue to permeate our lives and the world around us, then that can lead more to destruction than it can to building. And we are a people about building. And traditionally, we are taught that Tisha B'Av is a mourning and a yearning for the rebuilding of the actual physical temple in Jerusalem. But for those of us who don't necessarily want there to be a rebuilding of a third temple, but instead want to rebuild the fabric of our society and rebuild the strength of the Jewish people, then we have to still keep that same message in mind. Okay, so let's go. Allison says, but isn't it important to use that anger that may motivate you to constructively make change, like in racial and social justice? It's more important not to internalize the anger, but how we can use it for a positive. Only let anger serve you to make a positive change. Yes, so I agree with you, Allison. Yes, I think, again, this is not supposed to teach us that you can't have any anger and you can't be frustrated and angry about injustice. Of course not. But what are you going to do with that? And as you point out, Allison, how do you not internalize that, and how do you shift it into something else? How do you reform it into something else? Yes, thank you. Okay, Abby. Hi, Abby. Abby, you want to share?
Okay, so looking at it, it does say you can have anger, but just for a moment, like, and 1/100th of a second is a millisecond. So just a moment, okay, like a flash, like a flashlight, you know, some flash, that's
Yeah.
like a moment. So, and you can have many moments of the anger, but not to keep the anger. But, and they said Balaam was the only one to fix the moment exactly, because when he cursed, I guess that's when God or told him, I don't know, something happened where he was going to curse the Israelites, and then, but then all of a sudden, I guess God entered at that moment of anger. So maybe that's what it is God. So he said only wicked Balaam was ever able to fix the moment exactly. So he was able to, he was the only one to change. But I don't understand the last part of the fact it's not the proper way to do things. I mean, you know, like he's saying,
That's in the sense that it's not proper to try and set up a strategy to bring your anger onto someone else, because in that story there's a man who's frustrated by someone else, angry at him, this man who's annoying him for one reason or another, and so in his mind he wanted to figure out the exact time where if God's gates of anger were open, if he could also direct the curse towards this man at the same time, that it would be exponentially destructive to this man. So that's that. And the first thing in terms of Balaam is, I think what the rabbis are trying to teach us is not that Balaam had the power to stop God's anger, but that there is no one, there's only this one man, Balaam, who had this special connection with God's anger, but that no one else is supposed to spend their time trying to figure out actually when exactly is God's anger and how to maximize that. Because if you were to spend your time, like this character at the end of the story, Rabbi Joshua, if you're spending your time looking for those moments where you can inflict the most amount of damage with your anger, because the assumption is if you could figure out when God's anger is reigning, then if you could capitalize on that, then you could bring about destruction on an exponential level. And we should not be doing that. And so the story about no one besides Balaam, in other words, there is no one out there. So don't even waste your time trying to figure out that exact moment. In other words, don't try and spend your time figuring out how you can inflict the most damage. Because as Maimonides taught, the anger leads you, if you are a prophet, if you are a leader, if you are wise, all the positive qualities that exist within you disappear as soon as you allow anger to reign. And so be careful, people. Be aware of your anger. Make sure that it's not overwhelming you, and make sure that you limit it. And also make sure that if you want to do justice in the world, that it's not anger that is leading that cause for you, because then it won't be as productive as if you lead with love or rachamim or compassion, as we talked about last week with God's prayer. There are other ways in which you can target making change, but if you're doing it through the lens of anger or resentment, it is going to be more destructive than productive. That's what I'm taking away from this. Jeff.
A couple of comments. Number one, when you talk about strategic, that's not the term that you would think is being used. You're thinking more in terms of premeditated action. And when you're living to premeditate anger, you are living in a grudge-holding environment, which means you are living in the past and can't look to the present and the future to change your behavior or to ameliorate the situation. You are locked into a destructive mode, especially if you're thinking in terms of how to premeditatedly respond with anger.
Yeah.
So that it is a human destructive effort. And when you talk about letting that moment pass, you have to return to the thoughts of the present and how to make that response in a positive mode. And that's difficult for most people, unfortunately.
Oh yeah, it's definitely difficult. And that's why I think, thank you, Jeff. I love that interpretation. Thank you for that. I think that is exactly why we are reminded of these things, right? The reason the Talmud and the Torah repeat concepts and why I find myself in our learning together repeating many of the same tropes over and over again is because that is our tradition believes that repetition leads to positive change, that ideally positive change. Repetition could lead in the wrong direction, but our tradition is hoping that repetition, for example, of saying prayers multiple times a day, for talking about things over and over again, that is supposed to help you change your behavior. We are a behavior-based tradition. And so the more we can talk about things and start to experiment with ways in which we can change ourselves, the better. A couple of notes here. Nan says, what an interesting topic to discuss on the day when we all say goodbye to John Lewis. Yes, how to channel anger to get into good trouble. Absolutely. I was only able to watch part of it, but you're right. There was a great New York Times podcast, might have been last week or whenever it was, that talked about his legacy and how he used language in a way that was not violent, but brought about a passion, but at the same time really was someone about nonviolent action. And if we're going to change the world, we have to do it non-violently, right? And so it's completely appropriate. Thank you, Nan, for making that connection, right? How can we live by that? Because our tradition, and by the way, a lot of that, the nonviolence movement comes based on biblical and traditional texts from both Christianity and Judaism, right? These are things that speak and resonate with our morals and our value systems as Jews. So thank you. And Miss Jones said, be kind to others and being empathetic and being the wiser, using wisdom to pray for wisdom and to be a positive influence and see the healing that lives offer. Thank you very much for that. Okay, Susan. Hi, Susan.
I had to unmute. Deep breath is one of the, it seems like this is take a deep breath and, hold it in and think before you lash out. I thought the Balaam story was very good. He expresses anger by beating that donkey, that poor donkey, the she donkey, many times. And he comes out very foolish with this. And I think, they didn't go into that more deeply, but God was smart in this instance, saying, okay, do what you want, and so on. And he let him then end up coming to bless the people of Israel. Was there something in the Sadducean here? Because weren't they in conflict with the Pharisees and the Zealots, the Essenes, and leading to Sanat Hanim, which you talked about before?
Yeah, that's a really yes, probably. I would want to do some more research on that, but I think that's a great interpretation, right? That already, that's also about a conflict of perspective and ideology and theology, and in those moments we may want to lash out and curse, but that's not necessarily what we should be doing. But I like that. You're right. Yes, I think that story is about how do you respond when there's someone who has a different worldview than you, who is coming at you either maybe on purpose or not, and how are you going to respond? And you might just want to respond with anger, but that's not how you should be doing it. Thank you, Susan. Always love your comments and questions. Merle. Hi, Merle.
When I was little, my mother always taught us to, when you are in a confrontational situation, to treat the other person with kindness, perhaps over kindness. And I never thought about it until professionally I had to deal with confrontational situations. And it makes sense, why bother to buy into their issues? They get overwhelmed by how you respond to them. And if you respond to them without being angry, they will back off because they have to figure it out themselves.
Great. Thank you, Merle. Great point. Thank you for sharing that. There are a couple, Allison asks a few things. I still don't understand why Maimonides even advocates for feigning anger at all. And also, is the anger reaction because it's a showing of our lack of control over the situation, a frustration response? Listen to me, this matters to me, don't ignore me. To the second point, is anger reaction? Yes, sometimes anger is a reaction of wanting to be heard and needing to feel seen. And whether or not that's linked to specifically this story, I'm not sure. I'd have to think about it a little more, but for sure that is a reason why frustration and anger does exist. Absolutely. The understanding of why Maimonides would even advocate for feigning anger at all, another good question. Off the top of my head, I would say that there is the decorum, social decorum that comes when you are a part of a group, and that sometimes a lack of emotional response can really be off-putting. If you are not engaged in a situation in the same way that others are, you may either ostracize yourself, or you may lead to some dynamics that could be unhealthy in that setting. So my assumption would be that sometimes you need to be a part of something, even if it's not your true feeling. You need to be a leader, and sometimes being a leader means you have to act a certain way or do certain things, even if deep down you aren't living by that truly, potentially. And so that feigning anger is a way to make sure that you can guide, because sometimes if our anger is to help guide towards a better world or to righting an injustice, sometimes you need to express that a little. But I think what he's really trying to get at is there's a difference between having the facade of anger, and there's another to really internalize anger. And that, as his second paragraph seemed to point out, that it's when you internalize it that it becomes destructive. And of course, the challenge is, how do you feign something without it becoming internal and it overtaking you? And that's a challenge we all face. Okay. Sydney asks, do we see a need to have a fixed time to align with God's anger so that we can also anticipate a timeout? I mean, right? Remember timeouts when you're a child? Sometimes people don't seem to do timeouts anymore. I don't think that's on the parenting protocol anymore, which is interesting. But there is this idea of, yes, can we create a space for our anger to exist and allow ourselves that space, whatever that timeout could look like for you personally? Do you allow yourself to have that? And as long as you don't sit in it, it probably is a very healthy thing to make sure you have that outlet. How do you release that? Is it that you write it in a journal and you just write down all your frustrations? You take 5 minutes. That's more than 1/1000th of a second. That's okay. But you take a fixed time regularly where you talk to someone specifically, whether that's a friend, a partner, or a therapist, about that anger, whatever it may be. There is, in much of our life, it's about finding those moments where we can focus on something, be in it, and then we can move to something else. So thank you. Great question. Just see if there's anything else. All right. I think that covers most of it. I see there are a few more. I think Abby has another question. Go ahead, Abby.
Well, I find that there's a contradiction in this. I mean, although these are excellent lessons, but when you read the Bible and look at the book of Job, I mean, look, most of the Bible is God is very angry. Most of the Bible. So I look at these things, I go, oh yes, this is really good. These are the kinds of things you need to do. But if you really look at the Bible, it's a contradiction. And I also find too, similar to what one of the other person mentioned about the suppression of anger, because anger is a feeling just as much as joy. And I think that in the Jewish, or more Orthodox kind of look of religion, there's a lot of suppression of feeling. So I just see some contradictions, and I don't know that it's hard to grapple with it, because there's these great lessons, but at the same time, when you're looking at the role model, it's opposite,
Yeah, that's a good point. However, I think we're supposed to look holistically, Jewishly, at all of our texts, and that while the Torah does serve as the baseline, the Mishnah, the Gemara, the Shulchan Aruch, all these other teachings, Midrash, all of these things are supposed to round out what we find as the base and the foundation of the Torah. So even though God may present God's self in one way in the Bible, or at least for, God actually presents God's self in many ways in the Bible, there are so many layers, just like, for example, the laws of Shabbat. They are not clear in the Torah. It took the Mishnah and then the Talmud to really flesh out, and even other law codes to flesh out the laws of Shabbat. So there is a concept that may be presented with the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and Tanakh and the prophets and the writings, and yet there are gleans to that which we also are supposed to look at. That the complexity is not supposed to be limited to just the complexity we find in the Torah. But that's why when we study this, we do find those contradictions, we find those challenges, and our tradition dives into those contradictions and asks the question, how can both exist? Because we do live in a world where so many things exist side by side that seem to be contradictory to one another, and yet they still exist. So if we're going to live in a world that is so complex and at times feels so contradictory, our tradition is trying to model that and supposed to get us thinking in a way that can somehow formulate our own interpretations of that complexity and that contradiction. But you're right, it does feel contradictory, and I would say that it's supposed to feel that way because that's where the meat is of all of this. So thank you, Abby. Susan, one last comment before we close out.
One last comment was like to Abby too, that God is angry a lot, but the people misbehave a lot and don't act honorably or follow his commandments. And just as you said, the Talmud tries to sort things out. I just wanted to comment at the timeout. My daughter used it very effectively with her kids. I love that concept. And there was some tips for getting through this pandemic too, was to have a time that you're going to be angry. Set aside a part of the day, whenever it is, and then limit your anger there and listen to the news or whatever like that, and don't let it absorb you the whole time.
Oh, nice. It's good advice. Well, thank you, everyone. I hope you spend a little bit more time this afternoon, as we are still commemorating Tisha B'Av, sitting both with mourning, maybe thinking about your own anger, how you express your anger. How can you transition and shift the ways in which you express your anger a little, or how can you use some of the tools that were brought up today, a timeout, so to speak, or some way of figuring out how you can not let your anger overwhelm you or overwhelm your life or cause destruction, but instead could be shifted. And you feel free to continue to dive into that text that we just studied, because it's not easy. Feel free to go back and look at the comps at Bar Comps' story, or of course, feel free to reach out to me to continue the conversation. And I look forward to learning with all of you again next week. So an early Shabbat Shalom, and thank you again for being with me today. Bye.